Rugby on Off the Ball.
With Vodafone, official sponsors of the Irish rugby team. We all belong to the team of us.
So Andy Farrell has named his squad for the first test against New Zealand on Saturday morning. It's a long expected lines, front row of Porter, Sheehan, Furlong, Tadhg Byrne and James Ryan in the second row. Peter O'Mahony gets a start with Josh van der Fleer and Caelan Doris starting at number 8. It's Jamison Gibson-Park and Johnny Sexton, as expected, the halfback combination. Keith Earls selected on the wing alongside James Lowe, Gary Ringrose and Robbie Henshaw in the centre, and Hugo Keenan at full back. Among the replacements, well, a lot of experience: Dave Heffernan, Finlay Beelum, Cian Healy, who despite it felt tour being over yesterday, is named among the replacements. Kieran Treadwell, Jack Conan, Conor Murray, Joey Carberry and Bundy Aki on a very experienced bench. Rúaidhrí O'Connor of the Irish Independent is with us. Evening, Rory.
Hey Nathan, how's it going?
No major shocks in that 15?
No, the only real shock was that Cian Healy was on the bench, and even the fact that he's in the number 18 jersey, which is usually designated for the tight head prop replacement rather than the loose head prop replacement, suggests to me that by the time Saturday rolls around, Tom O'Toole might be filling that jersey and the Finlay Beelum might be covering the loose head side of the scrum. I just can't see how, even if he is not as bad as we thought, I don't see how he's going to be able to turn himself around that quickly. That looked like a nasty injury. I hope he's fine. I mean, it'd be an incredibly good news story if he came off the pitch in that fashion and was okay. But I find it hard to believe. I guess Keith Earls is a bit of a surprise. I mean, Kieran Treadwell started the other night in the second row and they took him off after 50 minutes and he's gone on the bench. You know, they kept everyone else pretty much on ice. Bundy Aki went 80 and he's on the bench. But Keith Earls went 80 and at the age of 34, he's gone. He's starting again. And when you look at the bench cover, there's no one really to bring on. There's no one obvious to bring on for Keith Earls. So you just wonder. Obviously, there are injuries. There's COVID with Mac Hansen and stuff. You know, that they're lighter maybe than they thought they were going down. But if the plan was always to start Keith Earls on Saturday, why did he play 80 minutes on Wednesday night? Maybe James Hume's injury forced their hand in terms of changes. I'm not down there. I don't know that that's those questions, but that seems strange to me. Otherwise, yeah, O'Mahony over Jack Conan. You could say it's a form call, but I didn't think Peter O'Mahony was pretty impressive in the last game of the season up in Ravenhill. Big night for him. First game back on New Zealand soil since he got dropped as Lions captain. So that, he's got a point to prove. But yeah, it's I think it's all of the available centrally contracted players are either in the starting team or on the bench. So it's the big hitters are out in force.
From the minute the Six Nations finishes and we start turning our attention towards the trip to New Zealand, everyone's watching the provinces and we're talking about bolters and players who will get their opportunity in experimentation. This is a very experienced side. Now, injuries and COVID have maybe been a factor in that. Are you surprised that at the start of what Andy Farrell himself has said is the World Cup cycle, that there isn't more experimentation, or will that naturally come in the second and third tests?
It probably more due to injuries than anything else. Like he's added those 2 Maori games for a reason, and he blooded 5 new faces against the Maori on Wednesday. Things didn't go particularly well, and he can point to that as a reason why you can't come out against the All Blacks with anything less than your strongest team. It was smart doing that in terms of like this gives it takes the pressure off him to try and start Joey Carberry, for example, or give Joe McCarthy a debut. He'll feel like getting those minutes under their belts in the midweek games will probably be enough during this window. And when you think about the scale of the challenge, playing the New Zealand in the first test in Eden Park, just over a year out from a World Cup, this really is about tuning up your starting 15 and subs and getting them ready for that experience. This isn't really an environment where you would blood someone for a new cap in an ideal world. And I think there's a benefit for the World Cup in winning one of these 3 test games at least, because he's also, while he also wants to build depth, he also wants his first team to be winning and playing very well, and that's why he's gone with all of them. I can understand it, and really, based on Wednesday night, very hard to argue any of those selections.
What are you basing on Wednesday night? Because Ireland came into this with, Leinster losing 2 huge games at the end of the season, Munster struggling for form, so maybe expectations quite weren't where they were 3-4 months ago, but it feels because of Tuesday night there's now a real fear and trepidation going into these 3 tests that not never mind Ireland not winning one of them, but actually they could find themselves on the end of a bit of a beating like on the last trip to New Zealand. Has there been an overreaction to a team thrown together only in the country 3-4 days?
I don't think it's an overreaction. I think if you didn't have the injuries and you just lost the game, then the reaction wouldn't have been as bad. But as players started dropping like flies and particularly in a very difficult position for Ireland where there's not a huge amount of depth like loose head prop, you started to realise that the itinerary, the size of the squad and the lack of depth could really come back to haunt Ireland over the course of these 3 weeks. The performance itself, they're only in country, 8 or 9 days. Those players weren't really, you don't get prepared for a midweek game. You're really there to prepare the test team. So you don't have a huge amount of time to get a bit of flow yourselves. You have new combinations. Someone said to me, like, there's a load of players who were not Leinster players effectively playing a Leinster game plan. That will obviously cause difficulties. And the Maori were really good. They were quick. And they kind of issued a reminder of what New Zealand rugby is all about. Ireland played into their hands. Their tactics weren't great. Their execution was worse. Their kicking was poor, and they kicked Lucy to a back three that was really, really dangerous. And when they copped things on after half time, they weren't far off. So it's more, I think, the realization of how difficult those two games are, plus the thinness around certain positions, and the starting 15 and the 23. My concerns, I have concerns about the kind of type 5 replacements, but starting 15 anyway for the weekend is capable of winning against any opposition in the world. But if you lose Andrew Porter, Tadhg Furlong, or even Johnny Sexton, you're in real trouble down there, and that's a major risk for me. And I think that Wednesday brought that home, and it also it's the first Ireland tour I haven't gone on since I wasn't on the 2012 tour, so it was my first time kind of getting up early to watch Ireland, and the players in black ran rings around them, and the rain fell on them, and they were haunted, and I was like, God, this is what touring New Zealand's all about. It's a scary proposition, and maybe we'd all underestimated that a little bit.
In terms of those three key positions then, with Porter, Furlong and Sexton, and the lack of depth, what can Andy Farrell do during this series to fix some of those problems?
Tom O'Toole is someone I think that they've high hopes for, and they think that he can be a backup to Tadhg Furlong by the time they get to the World Cup. And he's not on the bench tomorrow. I think he will be, on Saturday, but I think he will be the time kickoff comes around. And I think he's someone that could benefit. He was okay the other night. He was fine. He didn't stand out, but he wasn't one of the major problems. He's a heavy hitter. He's good in traffic. He's not Tadhg Furlong, but Tadhg Furlong's Ireland's greatest ever tight head prop, I would argue, and they don't come along very often. Porter, his real problem, like Dave Kilcoyne's injured, Jack McGrath's being released by Ulster. He hasn't been able to sustain his high levels, and Cian Healy's got an injury now, and really believe that they're not convinced by any of the players that they have. And Jeremy Loughlin comes out and he gets concussed after 90 seconds and comes back on controversially, but goes off at half time, and now he's going to be stood down for 12 days, so he can't make an impact. And Ed Burns on a flight out to New Zealand, but he was playing for the Barbarians last week, and he's playing catch up, and there's not really any outstanding candidate to step up and in those positions. So you're kind of, and maybe this is the way with a country the size of ours, with a playing pool the size of ours, you are crossing your fingers for your most important players. We have outstanding loose head and tight head props in our front line, but beneath that we don't have the same level of quality. Out half, it's just they've left it very late to be trying to find their depth at out half, and Joey Carberry looked really, really ropey when he came on the other night. He looks like his confidence is shot, so that's a real issue, because Kieran Foley starts and he's been playing 12 for the last couple of years, and Harry Burns disappeared. Apparently he's injured, but he's played nearly as much at 12 as he has at 10 this season. Ben Healy didn't get selected. Billy Burns and Ross Byrne and Jack Hardy's injured, but they're all starting for their provinces, but they don't get the Ireland recognition, and it's just really muddled and shows maybe a lack of alignment between the top team and that's supposed to be there and the rest. So you're relying on a 30, a guy who's going to be 38 at the World Cup, who's undoubtedly the best out half there is, and on his day he's still one of the best in the world. But one thing I thought the other night was that when the Maori played at pace, a couple of Ireland's players, Bundy Aki, Keith Earls, were starting to look a bit old, and New Zealand is no country for old men, pardon the cliche. I wonder how if Sexton gets through this and is still performing, you could have, if he gets through 3 weeks against the All Blacks in a row and comes out of it and performs well, we can be a lot more confident that he's going to do well in the World Cup next year. But this is going to test every fibre of his being as a 30. He's still 36, I think. He turns 37 after the tour, I believe. That's massive. That's huge strain on his body, and he's up against Bowden Barrett, who's got bundles of pace, and they've picked a massive pack and a really hard carrying back line. He's going to come in for some treatment in the next couple of weeks, and this is a real test of where he is,
Well, on that then, because again, talk about conversations that have been going on forever. Like, there was a feeling at one stage, do you even bring Sexton on the tour, and do you go with Joey Carbery and give him this run of games? Then it goes, well, maybe you play Sexton in two of them and you give Carbery the second test. If Carbery looks shot in confidence, Harry Byrne is struggling with injury. Are you now looking at a likely scenario that if Sexton is fit, Sexton starts all three tests?
Yeah, I don't see while we want to spread the wealth and get players experience, at some point you have to earn the Ireland jersey, and especially over in New Zealand, away from home in a series like this, there's no such thing as a cheap cap. And Joey Carbery got 15 minutes off the bench the other night to prove his case. He's had big games in back end of the season, and he's been poor. And I think he's a fabulous player. I think he's probably more of a 15 than a 10, but he's still capable of doing a good job, as we saw in Paris. But he's not in the form that he was in at that point of the season. His first act the other night was kick the ball straight at the touch. He dropped another pass. He didn't look confident. He didn't look like he was in control. Frawley was okay, but you're hardly going to. It's unlikely based on what we saw the other night that he's going to be on the bench. And really, Ireland are scratching around, and they almost need Sexton to get injured so that they have to play these players. But Andy Farrell has to go to Johnny Sexton either with a plan, or to say, look, this guy's playing better than you at the moment. And no one is doing that at the moment. No one is kind of pushing him. And that's a real concern. That has to be a real concern because of Sexton's age profile. I know Johnny Sexton probably thinks we're all trying to finish him off. It's not. It's just the obvious risk that's there, and the fact that Ireland are not prepared. In 2015, he went down before the quarterfinal, and Ian Madigan came in having started 4 games in the previous World Cup cycle against 4 mediocre opponents. Less than mediocre, 3 tier 2 teams and Scotland, I think, in a World Cup warm up. 4 years later, Johnny Sexton was rested for the Japan game, and Jack Carty was picked for having never started the game for Ireland before the World Cup warm ups. I mean, that is the epitome of bad planning. And I don't think they knew they were going to New Zealand this summer, so this wasn't the time to experiment either. Maybe the Italy game in the Six Nations, they got Carbery in for a few games over the last while. But they can't account for him dropping form either. So now they're down to that if you look beyond that, they brought Harry Byrne, who just can't stay fit, and Leinster don't seem to be able to. They can't convince themselves that he's better than his brother, whereas Ireland clearly have. It's a real issue, and I know we keep talking about it. We've probably talked about it on this show more than anything else I've talked about. But that's because it's when the World Cup, if the World Cup goes a cropper, this is where it's probably going to happen. So I think it's a massive red flag on this Ireland squad, and it's a real source of concern. If Sexton makes it and is able to do it, it's going to be an incredible story, and everyone's going to be delighted for him. But if he doesn't, I just struggle to see what the plan B is. I don't think they really know themselves.
Just briefly, you mentioned there a couple of times the thinness of the squad, and said there are injury issues with a lot of players at the end of the season. Is there a reason that they didn't bring more players?
When I asked the question, it was that they didn't want guys going off tour, that they wanted to have a lean enough squad that everyone would be involved with a chance of seeing action in at least one of the 5 games. I thought they could have brought 1 or 2 more, particularly in those specialist positions, those attritional positions. They lost Rob Herring before they even got going, and they had to call up Niall Scannell, who actually was excellent the other night, despite the fact that he only arrived off the plane and got a spot on the bench. They've, Ed Byrne, it hasn't been confirmed yet, but Ed Byrne, I believe, is on the plane over. So that's 2 replacements that they've had to call up from their holidays so far. And with James Hume likely to come home, Healy struggling, and a test against the All Blacks this weekend, and Ian Henderson ruled out, probably going to need more, So I thought it was certainly they've a massive backroom staff going with them. They've thrown resources at this tour. I don't believe it's a financial consideration. I think Farrell wanted to be as close to a World Cup without being crazy about it as he could. World Cup was 33. He thought 40 would get him by. But the more, just seeing the game on Wednesday night and the way they were dropping like flies, you do wonder whether 1 or 2 specialists could have been brought, or even maybe like a Ross Maloney and Jack O'Donoghue as a midweek captain to kind of bolster that team and give it a bit of leadership during the week, because they really, I know Aki, they made a lot of sense to make him captain the other night, but I thought he is a quiet player. You know, he's not a player who often has often captained the team. And I thought Ireland, when the penalties were going against him, he was very, very quiet. He played quite well, you know, reasonably well, but I thought in that regard, I'm not sure it worked out with him as captain, and I wonder if someone just given that role as the midweek captain would have worked out. Again, I didn't call for this before the tournament, it's after time in a little bit, but I wonder whether that may turn out to be a mistake.
The All Blacks team then, 3 Barretts named, Bowden Barrett out half, Richie Mayunga among the substitutes. You mentioned the size of the pack there. Anything else that stood out?
Well, it's the big thing that they're talking about over there is the selection of Scott Barrett at 6. So Scott Barrett is the kind of less heralded of the 3 Barrett brothers, but he's a brilliant second row for the Crusaders, who kind of has been a bit he struggles to break that Brodie Retallick, Sam Whitelock axis in second row. He might be getting close to it now, but the last time they tried this was the World Cup semi-final against England. It's the only time he's ever played at 6 for the All Blacks, and it went disastrously wrong, and they're kind of all worried that it's going to go wrong again. I think it's a smart selection, to be honest. Their pack is enormous, and it looks like it's not enormous in South African terms, but in Irish terms, it's a very, very big pack. It's like an English pack with a lot of line-out options. They're a little bit light maybe in prop. I don't think they'll cause Ireland the kind of scrum problems that some other teams could, but they do have incredible ball carriers who are able to carry hard. They're fresh. They're early in their season. And if you think about how Ireland beat them in November, they're going to be smarting, and I think they're being sent out to beat Ireland up on Saturday. You know, Lester Fanganuku make his debut at 11. He's a really, really, one of these kind of Lomu prototypes they've rolled off over the last couple of years. They've got an incredible selection of wings that they're not picking, and he's really, really good. Quinn Tupeya is the 12. He's not a distributor. He's not a passing 12. I'm sure he's got good skills, but he's more direct. And then they have Sevu Reece and Rico Ioane, who are well capable of ripping things open. So they can beat you up. They can beat you both ways. They can beat you up and then go wide out to those boys, and they'll cause you problems. And then Geordie Barrett, if it's the right one, can kick goals from anywhere in the pitch. So they've got it all. And yet Ireland have greater cohesion, and New Zealand are still scratching around for their best team. So I wouldn't like to oversell them. They're really good players, but this team hasn't played an awful lot of rugby together and has had quite a disrupted week as well. So it's an interesting one. It depends on how quickly they can hit the ground running, because in the past they haven't quite put it all together in their first test of the year. This is where traditionally they've been a little bit vulnerable, in as much as any New Zealand team can be.
How long is Joe Schmidt going to be there before we start talking about how many offloads they have per game?
Yeah, I think he might struggle to limit the offloading of these boys. And the thing people always said about Schmidt, the people who worked with him, was that he never stopped you from making an offload. He encouraged it as long as it was the right decision. And I think when you have ball carriers as powerful and as skillful as these guys, he might be more willing to let the leash off, and that they may not get roasted in the video room quite as much as the Irish boys who weren't able to win the collisions in the same way. Like it's such an incredible storyline to be following over the course of the week. Ian Foster will be back, according to his press conference this morning. Foster will be back in the coach's box on Saturday, as long as he returns a negative antigen, I presume. And I don't think Schmidt will be certainly visible in it. I'm sure he'll be there somewhere or watching quite closely. I think he is going to have an influence on this series, but he might not be front and centre in the way people expect it. Like if Foster's back, he might step back into the shadows, but he's there and his influence is probably being felt.
All right, Rory, great stuff as always.
Cheers, Nathan.
Full
Rugby
reaction
on Off the Ball.
With Vodafone, official sponsors of the Irish rugby team. We all belong to the team of us.